The movie begins in a dark room with many doors. A little dragon is trying to run away while an old man chases after it. Suddenly, another man appears and locks the door, trapping the old man inside. Even though the old man tries to use magic against the newcomer, it doesn't work. Fast forward to an ordinary morning in London, where Paul experiences a string of unfortunate events. He oversleeps, his shoelaces snap, and his toaster malfunctions, causing him to rush to a job interview. Along the way, a peculiar old man named Monty claims familiarity with Paul, but Paul, preoccupied with his interview, brushes him off. While pursuing a dog that snatched his scarf, Paul stumbles upon a door labeled applicants and decides to enter. Inside the building, Paul meets Sophie, another person there for an interview. They wait together and watch TV. Paul tries to talk to Sophie, but she'd rather watch TV. He doesn't learn much about the job except the company's name, Wells & Company, from a weird brochure. Then, Mr. Tanner comes in and laughs, sending one person away before calling Paul to follow him upstairs without explaining. In the main office, Paul meets his boss, Wells, and some other important people. They ask him strange questions that make him feel confused and uncomfortable. Paul notices cracks in the wallpaper that look like a map of London, but nobody else sees it except Wells, who seems impressed. However, Tanner says they've heard enough and sends Paul away. Outside, Paul finds his scarf on a dog, like it was waiting for him. When he gets home, he finds out his roommate is moving out, and they argue about rent. Then, a strange claw brings him a letter from Wells, even though Paul never gave them his address. The letter says he got the job, so Paul celebrates. The next day at work, the receptionist, Rosie, doesn't say much about the job. Tanner gives Paul a mug and shows him around the building. It turns out to be a law firm where they don't use computers. They go through weird places, like an under-construction area where Tanner worries about a stapler on the floor. They also pass by strange offices with old typewriters and mysterious tubes, but Tanner won't explain anything. Their journey ends at the main office where Sophie and Paul, now interns, wait. Tanner, their supervisor, tells them they'll get tasks soon. Paul talks nervously, trying to impress Sophie, but she isn't interested. Suddenly, Paul gets scared by a shadow, but it turns out to be just a harmless mouse. Rosie, another worker, interrupts and gives them maps to mark where there's a certain type of mineral. Paul is confused but spends the morning with Sophie studying the maps. At lunch, Paul is surprised when Sophie suddenly wants coffee, especially since she didn't like it before. They meet Judy and she takes them to a park. Something surprising happens when a lid on the ground suddenly opens up, and out comes a container. Judy quickly grabs it. She explains that the lady sitting on the bench is deeply into a book called Atonement, and Sophie needs to let her know when a particular part happens. Sophie is confused about how she can keep up with the story in the book. Judy tells her to hide in the bushes while she watches from far away. Sophie tries really hard to focus, and she's amazed to see what the lady sees in the book. When the right part of the book comes, Sophie signals, and Judy makes a man near the fountain fall into the water by moving her finger. This makes the lady on the bench and the man who fell in love with her start to like each other. Judy praises Sophie for helping, saying it makes it look like fate brought them together, even though the man's parents had planned for them to marry. Paul is confused by what's happening and asks for an explanation. He finds out that Sophie can see into the future, making her a seer. Judy reveals that their company is actually a group of magic users who use their powers to make money. Even though Paul is also an intern, Sophie is much better at using her powers, so Judy doesn't include Paul in their plans. Back in the office, Paul eats a sandwich and looks at the maps. Paul feels a surge of energy in his fingers and is able to find where certain minerals are located. It seems like Paul has powers too, like being able to find things using magic. Excited about Paul's new skill, Wells takes him to his private office, which is full of printers. He explains that the company is in a tough spot and they need someone with Paul's talent to help them. To win Paul over, Wells shares his own story of being manipulated by his family, saying his father forced him into a soul-binding contract. In Wells' office, Tanner is waiting, and Wells uses Paul's eagerness to prove himself by giving him a secret task, finding a special door. Paul agrees, but before he can ask more questions, he's told to leave. Paul keeps trying to search the company building carefully, looking everywhere, but he doesn't find anything. Van Spee, who has wild hair that shows she uses illegal magic, interrupts his search. Even though she seems nice at first, her magical hair warns Paul to be careful. Later, while Paul is sleeping at home, Casimir, who can control dreams, interrupts his sleep. Casimir tries to get information from Paul about his job with Wells. When Paul doesn't want to talk, Casimir uses magic to make him speak. The dream is strange, and Paul feels scared as Casimir shows his powers and eventually gets the truth about the special door from Paul. When Paul starts to wake up, he realizes he's still in a dream, and Casimir can still control him. The following day, Sophie arrives at work to witness Rosie showering a stapler with affectionate gestures. Meanwhile, Paul persists in his exploration of the company premises and stumbles upon the phrase, "Bank of the Dead," inscribed on the floor with stapler fasteners. Intrigued, he follows the arrow's guidance, leading him downstairs where he discovers remarkable artwork adorning the walls. His curiosity leads him to a dimly lit basement, marked with a sign declaring, "Goblins Only." Despite the warning, Paul opens the door, only to find an ordinary storeroom. Before he can investigate further, Tanner intervenes, warning him against further exploration and urging him to consider resigning before facing dire consequences. At the same time, Sophie works with Judy, who gets messages from hands coming out of the sewers. Judy explains that these hands belong to goblins, secretive creatures who have helped wizards secretly for a long time and can watch humans without them knowing. For their task that day, Judy asks Sophie to help reunite a lost pet with its owner by putting up a flyer in a store. This pet turns out to be the dog that had Paul's scarf. Meanwhile, Paul doesn't find anything important in his search and goes back to his office. There, he finds Tanner arguing with Sophie about contracts. At the end of the workday, Sophie suddenly wants licorice, even though she didn't like it before. Paul invites her to a pub for drinks to relax. They end up arguing about how well they did their jobs at the office. The next day at work, Paul meets Casimir, who acts like they're meeting for the first time since the interview. As Paul goes up the stairs, he meets Monty, who admits he intentionally distracted Paul the day before to get him to come to this company's interview instead of his original one. Even though Monty tries to stop him, Paul insists on going through, wanting to go back to the mysterious room he found. Following the feelings in his hand, Paul figures out the illusions and confidently goes forward. He enters a room full of strange things and magical objects. While exploring, Paul finds a stapler that he's repelled by at first. Using his powers, he discovers a goblin spirit inside it, pointing him in a direction before disappearing. Focused, Paul finds the special door and goes through to another part of the building. The door turns into a towel and falls on the floor. There, he overhears Wells talking about his father's involvement and the old boss's disappearance. Paul is shocked to learn that Wells is trafficking human souls, using employees as test subjects, and people who sign soul contracts lose their identities. Sophie is targeted next, which explains her strange behavior. Worse, the board doesn't know about it, and employee badges have surveillance devices. Paul realizes he can't hand over the portable door to the company. He grabs the towel, reads the instructions, recites a spell stating, "supermarket," and teleports there to test it. Back at the company, he brushes off Van Spee and hurries to his office. Paul removes Sophie's badge, explains the situation, and shows her the towel. Reciting the spell, they open a door to a bizarre space filled with portable doors. Hearing cries for help, Paul quickly pulls Sophie out. Rereading the label, he learns stating the destination first is crucial. They try again, successfully teleporting to Paul's apartment. Excited by the possibilities offered by their newfound power, Sophie eagerly drags Paul on adventures across the globe. They explore Egypt and Alaska, surf in Jamaica, and marvel at the aurora borealis. Sophie witnesses the heartwarming reunion of cousins at the shop, affirming her commitment to using her abilities for good. In moments away from prying eyes or during breaks, they continue their travels, fostering a deeper bond with each other. One afternoon, at the beach, Paul tells Sophie he loves her, but her soul contract complicates things. They decide to nullify it together. Back at the company, Tanner confronts them about the situation, giving them a tough choice: give up the door or leave the company for good. During a disagreement about what to do next, Paul and Sophie decide they'll get Sophie's contract later. They sneak back into the building at night, but the special door doesn't work right, and they end up in a room with printers instead of Wells' office. They're surprised to see the printers making contracts for things like gym memberships and rentals, all with sneaky soul agreements. They get curious and follow sounds and shadows to a room with maps, where there's chaos with papers flying everywhere and small fires burning. In the shadows, they see a strange creature eating pizza. Paul instinctively tries to use the special door to escape to Wells' office, but it takes them to a dark basement with scary markings that say, "Bank of the Dead." After finding a contract that shows some serious wrongdoing, Paul and Sophie run away through a scary tunnel. At the end of the tunnel, they meet a bunch of goblins. They try to run past them but end up in the goblins' forbidden area, where they find out that Tanner, their boss, is actually the leader of the goblins. He scolds them for not listening to his warnings. Then, Wells shows up and tells Tanner and the goblins to leave, causing a tense situation. Wells uses dark magic to turn the goblins into office supplies. Paul and Sophie try to escape through a special door, but Wells closes it, trapping them in a room with lots of doors. They hear Wells Sr.'s voice, who tells them about the company's dark past. Paul remembers a contract that could control Wells Sr., but they need to put it in the Bank of the Dead for it to work. Feeling hopeless, they search for a way out among the many doors, guided by Wells Sr.'s hint that all the doors lead to nothing. Paul refuses to give up and uses his powers until he finds a way to escape. Emerging onto the streets, an eager Wells Sr. leads the group back to the company, swiftly formulating a plan. He assigns Paul the task of delivering Wells' contract to the bank, while he prepares to confront his malevolent son. Meanwhile, Rosie sets off to retrieve her husband. Rushing downstairs, they encounter the goblins relocating soul contracts, prompting Wells Sr. to engage his son in a fierce magical duel. Amidst the chaos, Paul and Sophie attempt to retrieve the portable door, but Paul is overwhelmed and captured by goblins. Sophie desperately reaches out to Judy for assistance, but the goblins close in. Paul valiantly intervenes to protect Sophie but finds himself ensnared in a net. Rosie arrives wielding a stapler, revealing her true goblin identity as she frees another trapped goblin, Tanner's parent. Amidst their emotional reunion, Wells seizes the opportunity to ensnare his father once more. Paul attempts to intervene but is swiftly repelled by Wells' magic. As the other board members arrive, Wells holds them at bay, threatening harm to his father. He ensnares Sophie with his magic, demanding Paul surrender his soul contract in exchange for her safety. In a pivotal moment, Sophie communicates telepathically with Paul, encouraging him to harness his powers to conjure portal doors from scratch. With focused determination, Paul manifests several doors before him and selects one, leaping into the death bank. There, he swiftly delivers Wells' soul contract to an employee, facilitating a unique exchange. As the signer's soul is taken back, Wells loses his powers, allowing Wells Sr. to trap his son with magic. With Sophie's help, they unlock the portable door, allowing Wells Sr. to trap his son as punishment for his past actions. Wells Sr. destroys the instructions for using the towel, so it can't be used again. Sophie worries about Paul, but he comes back, now with his own powers. He gave Sophie her contract, and traded for Wells, securing their win. They celebrate with a kiss before Paul throws the towel into a passing laundry truck to keep it safe. After everything is settled, the company's board offers Sophie and Paul permanent jobs, which they agree to. Sophie uses telepathy to assure Paul of her true feelings, strengthening their connection as they hold hands. Meanwhile, the towel ends up in a hotel, where a maid accidentally activates its magic, causing unexpected things to happen.